Well, welcome to Leave Us Alone, the podcast that champions individual freedom and limited government. I'm Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. And today we're diving into something we've been into for a while and maybe continue to be into, but the question of what's happening with this shutdown. What are the politics of it? What's the economics? If you're new here, this show is about one simple idea. Government should be limited. Lower taxes, less regulation, fewer rules, more freedom and opportunity for all Americans. The Leave Us Alone movement protects taxpayers, property owners, businessmen and women, gun owners, homeschoolers, religious liberty, and others who simply want the government to leave them alone. Today, we're joined by Donovan and Mike Palicz, and we're going to get going on the question of what in the world is happening now and what's going to happen. Donovan, who joins us as a special guest star, is the president of Targeted Victory. He has worked at the National Republican Senatorial Committee for several election cycles, has worked a bunch of campaigns, and now does a lot of different advocacy. Liam, give people a sense of your work in D.C. You're one of the more talented, forward-looking Republicans in the D.C. area, and we're going to be talking about how this affects politics.
Grover, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. As you said, I started Targeted Victory here recently, but I spent the 15 years before that, one way or another, working mostly in the trenches with groups like ATR, working on tax policy, working on kind of more legislative side lobbying. What I found was, as you said, I think people value my perspective on, where the puck is going, looking around the corner of things like big macro issues like, is the government going to be open tomorrow? Things like that. And so what I've done coming over to Targeted Victory is working with companies more at a higher strategic level to try to figure out, how to navigate this landscape. I am of the perspective that, politics has fundamentally changed and the parties and their coalitions are changing and it's not going back. So while, people need to navigate this next year, the next 3 years, I think the out years are just as challenging. And so helping companies large and small to tackle those issues. And I think, today's conversation is a good kind of proxy for how scrambled our politics is right now.
Well, give us a sense as you look at it, who's winning, who's losing. Where do you start this? I mean, the Democrats have agreed to, 13 different continuing resolutions over the years. Not now. We Republicans used to get a little more blame than perhaps they do now. What's different about this shutdown than the previous ones you've lived through?
Well, I think first and foremost, the fact that we're 17 days in and it's like it's barely happening. I mean, you could read, I have the Wall Street Journal right here. It's like it's not A1 news. And I think we have sort of a diminishing returns of drama and suspense, whether that goes back before my time to certainly your times, the first time we did this in whatever it was, 96. And I think the early coverage, certainly in the Obama years, was based on that, this very climactic, very zero sum, and frankly, driven by the idea that Republicans are the instigators, Republicans are the problem. I think that has been turned on its head here, obviously, by virtue of the fact that Republicans are the ones that are trying to keep the government open, not the ones demanding something for it, but also the experience not only of 2013 and the surprise, I think, to most onlookers that despite the misadventures of 2013, Republicans had one of their best election cycles ever in 2014. And then in 18 and 19, while it was at one level the longest shutdown ever, it was also the most forgettable. We don't even remember quite why it happened. So I think this is the logical culmination of all that, where really the stakes are so low, there's nothing to be won. And yet at the same time, there's not much to lose, certainly not for Democrats. And I think that's what informs both Schumer's posture and Democrats more broadly. They don't control anything. They have no levers of power. So the most they can do is sort of withhold, right? There's sort of a Bartleby element of this. They just prefer not to. And at some level, they actually have an interesting position there where I genuinely think, and have thought all along, the only way this ends without a pretty embarrassing cave and climb down from Chuck Schumer is they just hold out long enough that Republicans get frustrated and try to do it themselves. I think that would be foolish for a number of reasons for a short-term CR, but I think that tells you why they're so cozy and comfortable where they are. I do think the early going was the tough part. It was a surprise to me, not that 3 Democrats broke ranks out of the gate, but that those 3 weren't indicative of cracks that were there. I think the fact that they held out in the early going and made it through to this end now puts them in a position where they're kind of happy to dig in. And if you're Chuck Schumer and all you're doing here is exercising the demons of March 2025, when people were ready to kind of run you out on a rail, he is now out in front and has probably the best standing with the base that he's had in some time. With that success comes heightened expectations. So now, if Schumer gives in for anything less than, certainly year extension, maybe more, I think it would be seen as a disappointment. And so it's easy to get into a shutdown. It's easy to hold out indefinitely. It's much harder to figure out a way out that doesn't end in, a humiliation, quite frankly.
Mike.
Yeah, Liam, I'm curious here because on the other side of this coin, you have the motivation for Republicans. And from their perspective, it's Democrat demands are currently $1.5 trillion of increased spending and undoing the success of the One Big Beautiful Bill on the Medicaid provisions and asking a Republican-controlled government to expand Obamacare. All are pretty big asks for something that's just to keep the lights on for the government for a 6-week bill. How do you see the motivation of Republicans here and any reason for them to lose the stiffening of their spine, or what would make them cave, or was there any reason for conservatives to come to the table at all?
I think you have to separate the legitimate concerns that Democrats have versus the sort of silly list of demands, as you said. And I think they've actually worked against themselves by laying out $1.5 trillion in demands, as you said, for a short-term CR. I mean, this is just not serious. I do think had they narrowed it to the ACA credits that they say they want, that is effectively everybody kind of understands looking through that. Okay, what are they actually after? It would be so much simpler just to say, okay, we want permanent extension. No, that can't happen. Okay, maybe we can sort of look at a short-term extension with reforms. That's how you could imagine this going in a functional way. I think by throwing in everything else, it opened up this whole line of argument around, illegals and everything else, which I think has kind of been a sideshow. I don't think that's been terribly effective for Republicans, but also that it was brought on by the fact that you've led with this laundry list rather than the things that you actually want. I think at the end of the day, when you talk to Democrats, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I've just been through enough of these where in 95, when the Republicans had their first year, they brought in the budget for Clinton, and they did a budget, and Clinton didn't do a budget, and they handed Clinton the budget that they did all their work on. Clinton vetoed it, and the entire establishment press announced that the Republicans had just shut down the government, which was the opposite of what had just happened. And then Dole almost immediately folded. And Gingrich was in an awkward position because the Senate had decided that they'd lost the fight because on all 3 networks, they were told they were the bad guys. I'm wondering if the difference in the status of the media, the fact that there are more television stations now, that there are podcasts, that there's more talk radio, that somehow the 3 networks no longer get to tell you what just happened.
I think that's huge. I think it's exactly right, Grover. And that's not new, and at some level has been true in recent years. But I think to your point, if 2024 was nothing if not a triumph of a balkanized media landscape where the big organizations not only aren't able to kind of dictate to a monoculture that consumes them, but in fact actually end up looking pretty silly when the dust settles because they've gotten so many things wrong for so long. But I do think that self-selection of what your media diet is, I think that's part of why everyone feels like they're winning, right? Because if you tune into channels on the right or channels on the left, they are reinforcing that the other side is, the victory is just beyond that hill to hold out. I do think the missing link here, and part of the reason that the sides are talking past each other, is that there are, I would say, genuine concerns among Democrats that if they if let's just say they open the government up. Let's say they even, take people at their work. This notion of going back and doing, I don't think legislative rescissions are the concern that they say it is, but I do think fundamentally the notion that any deal that you could agree on here might be revisited. They're not talking about that because that's not something that breaks through in the media, and it's not something that your average voter is sensitive to. But I do think that's the real underlying thing. And ultimately, you can describe that as the trust deficit, which has just been something that we've been dealing with and kind of dancing around for years and years. But it's just at an acute low here. And I think that's something that I'm not sure how you overcome that. But if and when the government turns back on, because it will be because we found a bridge to make both sides trust that the next step will not be kind of a rug pull.
And Mike?
Liam, just interested here. I know you kind of made this point early on, I think before the shutdown even began, that part of the calculation here for Schumer, trying to manage his own progressive base, the kind of the most activist wing of the party, is that it might ultimately be better for him to engage in the shutdown, pick the fight with Trump, even if he's going to ultimately lose and cave, to just prove that he was willing to have the fight. Do you still see that as kind of a motivating dynamic, or what is the off-ramp for Schumer here, or how he declares victory? Because I guess part of this too is if you're watching MSNBC, I'd say a month ago, the focus wasn't so much on extending the ACA subsidies, the Obamacare subsidies, as much as it was trying to, as an effort to remove Trump from office was the real motivating factor.
Yeah. I think there's a producer's element to this where they're successful beyond their intentions and they need to figure out what to do now. But I do think he had no choice in a sense, right? Like the March went so poorly for him that he had no choice but to fight if he wanted to keep his job. I think he likes his job. But now that you're into it, I think that question of the off-ramp is the right one to ask. And because they've put themselves in this position, there's this paradoxical element where they say, negotiate and we'll turn the government back on. And probably say, okay, we'll negotiate once you allow the government to be turned back on. And there's a sequential issue there. I think there's a way to get things worked out, but Schumer's not looking to get to yes. Now, the real question is, Schumer's calling the plays at some level, but his leadership exists at the pleasure and his standing exists at the pleasure of people at the margin, people like Jeanne Shaheen, people like Chris Coons, the sort of theoretical 5 to 10 people you could imagine who actually do want to deal, are uncomfortable with indefinite shutdowns, like value norms, things like that. And so I think the real question is, how did they get to yes? You're starting to see some of that flushed out, but even that, like when Jeanne Shaheen's being unserious about her asks, I think we're not close to the resolution. But really, like if you're thinking about how the optimal situation for Chuck Schumer, it's that he never has to cave and Republicans get so frustrated or Donald Trump decides that he's tired of waiting and there's a push from Republicans to change the rules, which I think would be a colossal mistake under these circumstances, but isn't beyond the imagination. And the longer this goes, I think the more it reinforces Schumer's sense that he should just push forward. Now, if you're looking at the horizon, I think the three things that are kind of looming out there as having potential to shake this up, and that's been the thing. The reason this has been so boring over 17 days, nothing's changed. Like nothing interesting has happened. Schumer stepped in at once by saying every day that goes by is good for us. Trump's done a couple things that have been disorienting, but nothing's fundamentally changed anything. And I think if you're looking ahead, you've got the November 1st, sort of window opening for open enrollment. So, Democrats think that's what's going to change things. I have my doubts, but certainly when those letters come out, that'll drive media coverage. For instance, the November elections in Virginia and New Jersey, you could argue that either way. Either Democrats have such rollicking victories that maybe, that changes the dynamics. It certainly won't get them to back down. Or let's say Chiarelli or, Meares, or like Republicans have a good showing in those elections. Maybe that is what, certainly if you think back to the 2021 elections in Virginia, that definitely changed the attitude of Democrats on the Hill who were then carrying themselves apart over reconciliation. I think the last thing is, and this would be the end of the even theoretical CR that Republicans are trying to push. If we get around Thanksgiving and you think about the volume of travel and the pressure that would put on the transportation system, on FAA, on the air traffic control system, I think that's the kind of thing that would change things on Capitol Hill. just because that suddenly this shutdown would intrude on people's daily lives and have the sort of impact that we just haven't felt yet.
Mike?
Yeah, one interesting thing here we've kind of talked about is when it comes to the question of the expanded Obamacare subsidies, which we've detailed before, how Democrats have twice voted to make these provisions permanent, but their demand now, as we've said, is an unserious one of they'll shut down the government until they're made permanent. But kind of on the grassroots side, on the conservative side of this, our own anecdotal evidence to share is when we first started doing our email campaigns on this and titling it Schumer Shutdown, we got enormous feedback and flooded with responses from our grassroots saying that basically, screw Schumer, burn it down, we don't care. And we thought that was interesting, and it also paired with kind of the responses we were getting on conservative talk radio. Conservative voters seemed much more interested in the opportunity that the shutdown proposes for some of the DOGE-like cuts the administration is focused on, and much more animated about opposing the Obamacare extension overall. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit. I thought an interesting dynamic, I think, from the administration has been that Russ's vote in the administration has been more on the sidelines, I think, than they signaled that they would be leading up to this. I know we've heard that from some members who expected some more action coming out of OMB.
I was expecting day-to-day announcements on layoffs, that all of these things were in the works and then didn't happen.
And I think they've started some of the RIF announcements right now. We talked about the idea of them doing a one-by-one announcement and using the opportunity to kind of signal how shutdowns represent a possibility for discussion of why are we funding this in the first place, kind of the Rand Paul point around this too. But Liam, I'm just curious about your thoughts on whether you expected more engagement from OMB, or if that would be, Republicans taking a more hardline approach would be something that would help unstick our current position in the shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a couple different ways to approach a shutdown. Typically, you either make it as absolutely painful as possible, and that's kind of what a version of that is what Obama did in 2013. I think that's kind of what you're describing, which is Russ Vought, in the torture chamber, kind of like pulling off a fingernail every day, and that is a way to get Democrats to yield. Now, that is a means to an end of ending the shutdown, as opposed to assuming the shutdown goes on forever and trying to really, expose. I think there's sort of a leverage play versus like a more ideological play. I think there's a way to do it, like a version of what we're doing now, which is making it at least painful as possible. So like you're paying the troops, you're paying federal law enforcement, you're making sure that nobody feels it, and then it goes on. That's how you got the longest shutdown ever. There's also ways where you just kind of let things happen and play it straight. I think we've picked and chosen from a number of different categories here, and so it's made it a little bit harder to, it's found this strange equilibrium where people are too comfortable, but there's enough being announced at least that, again, goes back to that kind of trust deficit. So I think there's a different timeline where it plays out differently, and it's much harder to core. There's another where you kind of let the chips fall where they may. I think right now it's too much of a grab bag. And what that's led to is Democrats can point to what Russ Vought is doing, point to Grim Reaper memes, and it kind of supports their position. So I am a little bit surprised, but that's mostly because their bark has been bigger than their bite. And that works up until we're into a shutdown. But once you're in it, you sort of made the threats, and in a sense, we've kind of been making good at the lowest possible level on the threats that were made.
And Mike with a public service announcement.
Just a quick reminder here, if you're enjoying the conversation, please take a moment to rate and review Leave Us Alone on your favorite podcast platform. It helps us reach more listeners who care about freedom. And don't forget to share this episode with friends who value liberty. Now back to the discussion.
I remember when you had the big shutdown under Obama, in my neighborhood, there was an open air park, which was a turtle park. It has like 3 turtles and people can sit on them, and there's no fence around it. Kids just walk up and can climb on it anytime, 24/7. The Obama people came and put a wire fence, like chicken wire fence, around it. Took more time to build that fence than anybody'd put into maintaining that park in the last 3 years. But they shut it, right? You cannot play this. And then there was another one where it was a kid's park, and it was maybe 18 inches high was the little fence around a park where you could go on a swing. They put a lock on that. Now, the kids could climb over it. The parents stepped over it and put their kids over it, but they wanted you to know that this was shut. They put guards at the open air World War II memorial that anybody can walk through at any time of day, standing there telling people you can't walk through this. So they were spending money to tell people that the government was shut down. This year, one of our ATR staffers was out at the Grand Canyon, and they just drove up, and there was a guy there, gave you a guard slip. It didn't take any money because that would cost money to take money or do money. So it was free, and you just drove past, and they gave you a little flyer about what was going on. They didn't shut down the Grand Canyon. Under Obama, they shut it down even though the state said, we'll keep it open. So that was the Obama guy saying, we will make this painful as we can. And the opposite seems to be the approach that President Trump is taking.
I think that's where Liam's making a really interesting point, that the less painful the shutdown is, the less the public's going to notice it and the less motivation there is kind of for either side to come to the table. So prolonging the whole thing, I think that's an interesting way to think about it. One other thing here, I'm curious, Liam, just in your takes on kind of the messaging. I think on one front you have the self-contradicting message of Democrats is that, Republicans, I'm thinking of Chuck Schumer here saying Republicans are in full control of government and they can open the government anytime, but also we're shutting down the government because we're fighting for healthcare. So kind of this dual contradicting yourself within your own statement. And I'm wondering if you think from the Republican perspective, maybe we're all overthinking this and maybe it's just sticking on a message again and again that we have passed a clean CR. There's a bill to open up the government. The Senate just needs to pass it. And I think we had an interesting thing last night. I don't know if you caught any of the CNN town hall. We actually had Rohan, ATR's intern, in the audience for the AOC and Bernie town hall, and he got to ask a question. And Bernie made the mistake of turning it back towards our intern, who made the exact point of, well, I think Chuck Schumer has voted for a clean CR 13 times in the last 4 years, and he has the opportunity to do it again. So in one sense, I thought the best part of that town hall was the messaging from ATR's own intern. I'm just curious if you think really Republicans should just be banging that drum and nothing else.
Oh, I absolutely think they should. And that's why I think and I understand why you need to arm your base with messages, but I also think that's why the sideshow about illegal aliens and whatnot that's not the point, because then you end up with this false equivalency between, like, you don't want to fight on their turf. You don't want to argue about their ridiculous demands. What you need to say is, we're the reasonable ones here. We want to keep the government open. Now, the tricky part is that over time, the media has internalized, and maybe the American people have internalized at some level, because Republicans are the party of less government that doesn't trust government and has a more, fundamentally different vision of the role of government. So it is sort of aligned with and that's why Barack Obama wanted to play up this notion that Republicans were shutting your government down. But I do absolutely think, because that is the moral high ground, that is the strongest position you can possibly have. I think having that vote as often as possible is the way to go and create as much discomfort as possible for the Democrats to maintain this position. Now, I do think what has changed over the last, and this is sort of over the last 10 years, I think there's been a rising frustration of Democrats watching Republicans go through the experience of the last 15 years and ending up in such a great place. I think they're looking and kind of speed running their own version of 2010s era intra-party kind of dynamics of, they're sort of their version of the Tea Party, their version of Ted Cruz tactics, their version of, heck, we're watching it play out in the Senate primaries right now. So I do think there is something happening on the Democratic side that they're working out. But what makes this fundamentally hard to deal with is, this is the party of government shutting down the government, and it's just uncomfortable for everybody, because Republicans aren't comfortable being the ones saying, no, we need to open the government up. And it makes for just a very strange dynamic that's hard to method.
Well, if we're looking for rational responses, take a look at where the Democrats are today. They gerrymandered the South for decades so that it slowed down becoming a Republican bastion in the House of Representatives. They came up with the racial gerrymandering of the Voter Rights Act, where they got the courts to say, you have to give as many as 19 seats, people are saying, to the Democrats for racial purposes, which does not exist in the Constitution. Both of these things are fading. And every 10 years, we do a census. And the next census is expected to put another 10 or 11 House seats into red states out of blue states. So if every 10 years you're losing 10 seats in the House, or close to all of the 10 seats in the House that leave a blue state and move to a red state, and there are now going to be some portion of 19 vote congressional districts that were created in racial gerrymanderings for the Democrats. If that's at an end, I don't know that all 19 flip Republican, but some, the Democrats, there's a reason they spent so much time doing something as horrific as having racial gerrymandering. They could be looking at a time where every decade they're losing 5, 10, 12 House seats, plus some portion of the 19 that disappear. When do they ever see the House again? And maybe that's why they're screaming like crazy now.
Yeah, Grover, I think it's a huge point. I think people have been mostly focused on those mid-decade redistricting fights, the sort of elective ones happening in Texas and California, and the kind of arms race there. But to your point, I think the broken out of the news this week amid the VRA arguments, I mean, that fundamentally changes things in a way that's different than just, oh, I'm going to wring an extra seat or two out of this state or that state. This fundamentally changes the composition of the House map nationally. And the other thing I would say is, I mean, to answer the question, obviously their best near-term chance is to do it with the weight of kind of history and the dynamics of being the out party during a trifecta and letting the wind at your back sort of help carry you over, which if they only need 5 seats, that's easy. The more the structural challenge rises with redistricting or with VRA, I think that gets much harder. And that's certainly what the Trump White House is weighing. I've never seen Donald Trump care what happens in an election he's not on the ballot on, but they are invested in this in a way that I think is pretty remarkable. If it's not here, it's not clear where it will be, because to your point, I think this, for a variety of reasons, the most recent census doesn't really reflect where the seats would be. That's going to have an impact on the electoral map going forward, and it's certainly going to benefit Republicans come 2032. But I think the more interesting thing beyond just the sticker kind of headlines of Republicans gaining 12 to 19 seats in the South is, if you think about what that means everywhere else, I mean, if you're not sinking so many Democratic votes into these handful of metro areas, I think it does make for a really interesting thing. I mean, just you end up with a House that's much more like the Senate in that maybe it looks much more like Maryland or something like that, where like you get one Republican seat, but we're going to kind of pack those in there, and we're going to where Democrats have the ability, they're just going to draw more seats that are more competitive. So I think in swing elections or sort of elections, the competitive environment, I think those Democrats have opportunities. But man, anytime when Republicans are having a good cycle, that is going to be an ugly one for Democrats. And I think it's going to change the dynamics of power within the caucus. I mean, ABC is a powerful group. I think watching those fights in those states where Democrats hold power, do they redraw things to maximize seats, or do they have to respect the kind of the prerogatives of the old guard and the incumbents? I think that's going to further accelerate that party dynamic that I was talking about in an interesting way.
Liam and Mike, thank you very much. Grover Norquist here, and that is it for today's episode of Leave Us Alone. Thank you for tuning in. If you found the discussion valuable, please rate, review, and share the podcast. It helps us reach more freedom-loving listeners. We'll be back next time with more insights on protecting your liberty. Until then, I'm Grover Norquist, working with you for a limited government controlled by a free people.